Here we are. We've got a scalable vector graphic icon, also known as SVG, and it changes in size as we need to change it. What I want to do is convert this into using CSS or being a CSS class that is still, scalable, right? So if I actually look at what's driving that, I can change the font size, and what do you know? The icons change as well. And then finally, I want to make sure that it's a CDN version of this. All of this is going to be driven by this blog post right here. So you can go ahead and jump into that blog post if you just want the code and step-by-step instructions. Otherwise, let's do it right now. All right, so first step, we want to make sure that you have Node.js and Git installed. If you don't already have those installed on your system, it's a good idea to have them installed anyway. The next step is to actually check out the icons we're going to use. So I'm going to use Simple Icons. It's a really cool open source directory of icons like this, right? So these icons are free to use. I don't believe you can charge someone for your own service that we're building. But the idea here is that we want to use some sort of SVG icons. These icons are completely up to you. You can do any icons that you want. I would just recommend that you make them square, i.e. something like 30 pixels by 30 pixels and a single color. But we're going to use those sample icons that I mentioned there, and we'll go into our dev folder. So I'm going to go ahead and do make dir dev. Of course, I already have the dev folder. But inside of that, I'll also do make dir dev, and we'll call this endless fonts. You can call it whatever you like, but I'm going to call it endless fonts. So I'm going to cd into endless fonts, and I'm going to go ahead and clone the simple icons directory inside of here. Right? So git clone, all of that. And that comes with a lot of things we just simply don't need, such as I don't need their Git repo. I don't need a lot of their Git related stuff. So I'm just going to run this command, and then I don't need a bunch of their files. I really just need that icons folder. To me, this is the fastest way to do it. You might think that it's probably faster to just download and drag over. But now that I've got that, I have my icons directory here. So if I open that up, I see, here's a bunch of icons, SVG icons that I can use. Now, I'm not positive if all of these are square, but my personal best results were using square icons, even if the actual icon in there is not square, right? So let's go ahead and find one that's not completely square, right? So that's more rectangular, but the artboard or the clipboard is more likely square. That's kind of what I mean by that. Okay, so now that we've got these icons, we need to convert our SVG icons. So now the first step, we're going to go ahead and make a package.json file. Now the reason for this has to do with just having something that describes what's going on with this project. It's not actually a viable package itself, but overall it's going to have, just some basic information about what we're building here. And since I'm using Node.js for the actual generation, which we'll see in a second, that's why I'm using package.json, not something different. Now, you could always make a README file and all that too, but I'll go ahead and just keep it with package.json. I don't have anything in there, but now I have these two files. Great. So the next thing we need to do is install the icon font generator. So this package is really nice. It makes it very easy to generate our quote-unquote web font icon kits, which essentially means that it'll have the CSS necessary as well as the fonts, the web fonts necessary to render out all of those icons that we had before, right? From Simple Icon. So we need to actually use that command. Let's go ahead and install it globally with this. So -G installs it globally. That will give us this actual command itself to be used anywhere on any of our packages, right? So typically with Node packages that I use, I don't always like to install it globally. So I often try it by installing it locally first, as in saving to the dev environment. I'll show you what that means in a second, which would add it to the package JSON information. So this is for those of you who are not familiar with this process. But if I were to do this for the very first time in a package I'm not familiar with, I'm just going to go ahead and do save dev like that, and then try out the commands that it has prior to just automatically jumping into the general global installation. So now that it is installed globally, if I hit enter, I should see something like this with my icons, or the actual icon generator. So it gives me all of the explanation as to what's going on. For all of this, I'm going to just go ahead and show you what I'm going to do. I want to make a final distribution directory. So I'm going to say make dir dist. So this is where we're going to put our actual final like project, if you will, which will include the CSS as well as an index file. And then I'm going to go ahead and copy this right here, and we'll go through it. So again, that's the actual command to run the icon font generator. And then it needs the directory as to where our icons are, which, you know, we saved them in the icon directory from simple icons, right? And then next, we say where we want to send these things, and then how we're going to name everything. I'll get over these in just a second. How we're going to name the files, that is, and then a prefix value, how we're going to have the actual CSS classes be prefixed. Then we're going to normalize everything. I'm going to ensure that it doesn't round any of my CSV files. I'm going to make them monospace. And then the last one, this is, I mean, aside from these commands right here, this last one is really important, or I found it really important, is to use a higher number. So 250 or higher, I think, is fine. The smaller numbers, when I went into like 25 as the height, the SVG was just distorted. When I left out the height, the SVG was distorted. So I wanted to declare a specific height to make sure that the actual CSS icon from the SVG is not distorted. Okay, cool. So what are these things right here? Well, I showed you that example earlier. This right here is the name, so endless.css. And there are fonts associated with that same name. So -n is handling that portion. -p is handling the actual class names, the prefix for the class names, right? So we've got our class name prefix right here, and so on. And of course, it's going to be the same one for the entire SVG set. If you need a different one, just make different SVG sets and different CSS files, and then you can merge those CSS files in the future if you needed to. Okay, cool. So how is it that we come to this name right here? Well, that comes from the SVG file name itself. So if we look at those SVG files inside of our package here, we see all of these different names, right? So you can name them however you like, and that is what will be generated here, right? So including the dashes right there. So that would be something like co-op. Okay. And it would render out that. Cool. So let's go ahead and run this. And you definitely want to make sure you have that out directory. Otherwise, it'll give you an error. So I'm going to run this, and it's got 576 icons. And here is what it generated. Right. So when I said the names, there are the names. We've got all of the various names for the fonts, the HTML, the CSS, and even a JSON directory. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Inside of my dist folder, I'm going to just drag it into Sublime Text so I can open it up. You don't have to do this. We'll just go over it real quick. So endless.html has, some CSS. This is just mainly for previewing it. And it's mainly so it ends up looking, similar to that. And then we have the actual CSS file, which is coming from the local directory right here, right? And then we go back into our HTML, and we can see all of the examples. We see the prefix here, and this is the core part of this that we actually generated versus, what we had before. Here, I just showed you the icon for a reason. I wanted to show you just the main part that we actually generated. Okay, so now that we've got that, let's actually take a look at it. I can literally just open up this HTML file because I don't actually need to run a server for this to work. And I got a lot of really cool stuff, right? So it's all there. And again, if you played around with it where you change the height or you change some of the other settings that they have, this page will change. It will regenerate. You just have to refresh it, and it should actually change accordingly. Now, something that I noticed was this giant icon here and then some weird square that's coming around here. That should not be the case. And for whatever reason, those icons were not working well. So I just found that they're broken. So I just removed them altogether. So going back into endless.html, the icons that are broken are Viber and Conda Forge. I had to do some research on that. Like, it took some time to actually diagnose which ones were not working, but those were the ones. So now that I've got that, I refresh in my example and it's gone. Okay, great. So now we've got the icons. They're all generated and they're ready to be pushed, right? So I showed you on the blog post, you can also look at it using, a Python server, but that's not completely necessary. Now, none of this would be actually that valuable if you weren't able to actually use your fonts on a real production site. So now what we're going to do is deploy this on Amazon Web Services using S3 and Cloudfront for a full-on content delivery network. So your users all around the world will be able to get these fonts pretty quickly to make sure that they're working correctly as well. So what you want to do is make sure that you have a S3 account, or rather an AWS account, so we can use S3. And if you don't have a custom domain, you certainly want to buy one of those too. If you don't have those two things at this time, stop the video, go make those things happen, and then come back. All right, so inside of the AWS console, inside of S3, I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new bucket. I'm going to put it into US East North Virginia. That's US East 1. And now you're going to want to use the domain name that you're actually going to use. So the entire domain name. So in my case, I'm going to use www.endlessfont.com. Right. So the live example that you see here is fonts. This is going to be endlessfont.com. I'm not going to copy any settings. And I'm just going to go through and say, well, I almost want to accept all things except for the public access control list ACLs for this bucket. I want to allow my objects to be public. Now you can uncheck them here, or I'm going to show you where else you can uncheck them. After you create it, you go into that bucket and you can go into permissions and we manage bucket, the public access controls. We hit edit and then we uncheck those again and hit save. So the reason I'm doing this is so that anyone can access these files and I can make them public. That setting has changed over time. It used to be where you would just click this and say make public and it would work. You now have to uncheck those things to ensure that that works as well. Okay, so with this bucket, we're going to go ahead and upload some files here. And naturally, you're going to want to go into your distribution folder and upload that entire thing. We hit next. Granting public read access, you can do that. Or we can do it in just a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and say next, upload. We should get 100% successful on this once it's all said and done. Now that it's done, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that these are public. And yes, we'll make them public. Now, making them public is not the same thing as allowing any site to use them. To do that, we have to change our CORS configuration. So back into this guide, you'll see down here the CORS configuration stuff, and we'll paste this in. Now, the allowed origin, if you want to restrict the origin to like a specific domain name, you can do that right here. So in other words, if you only wanted your site or my site to be able to work with it, you would put that right in here. That way, all of your resources are still protected, just protected in a different way. But I'm going to leave it in as all. That way I can test it locally as well, because you will want to make sure your local domain is in there too. And we'll go ahead and save that. Okay, so I'm kind of skipping around here a little bit. The next thing is we want to turn this into a static website. So the S3 buckets have the ability to be static websites. So we go into our properties here. We go into static website hosting. We're going to use this bucket to host a website. And it's looking for an index.html. Now, I actually don't have an index.html, so I'm going to change inlist.html to a different name. Inlist, of course, is actually my index. It's just that generator calls it the same name as all the other files, so we leave it in as index.html. This is now a static web page, or ready to be a static web page, rather. And we're going to go back into the properties there, back into static hosting, and then now we'll just set index.html. If you wanted a custom error page, you could do that. It's probably a good idea to do that, but I'm not going to cover that right now. And we're going to go ahead and save it. Okay, so what I should be able to do is actually see this inside of my bucket, right? So let's go to that index. I should be able to go to this URL and see it. So I'm going to go ahead and copy it into an incognito window, and there we go. So it's already a live functioning thing. And if I go to the root of it with no index file, it looks like it's not functioning right there. So let's go ahead and go back into AWS to see where it's saying it is. So in our properties, static hosting, this is the actual endpoint for that URL. I just overlooked it. And we press that down. And there we go. So now we have a actual live URL working for this S3 bucket. And then if we go into inlist.css here, there is my live CSS file as well. So I'll be able to reference this anywhere on any HTML project with the current settings. So I could replace this with this. Let's go ahead and try that out. I'll replace this with this, save that, and let's go ahead and open this page in a browser. And now it's showing some of those things out, right? I wrote out get.svg, so let's get rid of that. And the same icons are rendering. No surprise there, but they certainly are working in the way that I might expect, and they're working from that S3 bucket. Now, if you don't want to go any further, you could stop here. This is still a very viable method without a custom domain name and also without a content delivery network. But that's not my style. I want to go all the way. So I'm going to go back into S3, and something that the guide doesn't have that I'm going to add is a new bucket, and I'm going to call this endlessfont.com. Keep it in as this region, and I'm just going to use all the defaults there. And then inside of endlessfont.com, I'm going to go into my properties here, static hosting, redirect requests. That's important. And I'm going to redirect them to www.endlessfont.com. And we will initially have the protocol as HTTP. Later, we'll change it to HTTPS once we finished everything. So the reason for this is so when we actually add the domain of endlessfont.com, the subdomain redirects if there's nothing in there. That's the reason for that. Okay, so going into the next step is setting up Route 53. So what Route 53 is, it's simply handling your domain name. So we actually move our domain name over into AWS. So I'm using name.com for my domain name. You can grab it right here. And the domain name I'm using, of course, is Endless Font. And what I need to do is change my name servers so that AWS and Route 53 actually control this domain name. So let's go into Route 53. Click in there. And we're going to make this domain name inside of our hosted zones. We're going to create a hosted zone, and it's I'm going to use just endlessfont.com. And I'll hit create. Now, if you were wanting to use a subdomain of a domain name that you already had, I'll show you what you need to do for that too. But in this case, I'm going to show you the defaults, which is using the entire domain name inside of AWS. I'm going to go ahead and copy this, or I want to copy line by line because of how name.com works. So first line, we're going to go ahead and delete all of these old name servers. First line comes in. Make sure that period's not there. AWS has the period. We don't want it, right? So there's a period right there. Just ignore that. It says an error, and it's kind of obnoxious, right? So if that period's there, it says this. I wish it would just remove it, but it doesn't. So you add that name server, because I would imagine this is fairly common, name.com switching to Route 53. And then we add it. And this is absolutely necessary to do. So we finally add that final name server. Oh, let's apply these changes. So if you wanted to actually use a subdomain from a domain you already have, you would go into Route 53. You would create a new hosted zone. Let's say, for instance, like cdn.endlessfont.com, or rather fonts.cdn, or you could call it whatever you want here. But you would put that subdomain in. You would create that record. You would grab all of these name servers again. So you would grab each one individually into your domain registrar, look for DNS records, and then the type is a NS type, and then you would use it for whatever that subdomain is, right? And you would put all 4 of them in there like that. But of course, I am not going to do that because my name servers are on AWS already. So if I needed to do that same process into AWS, it's literally the same. You would make another hosted zone and add that hosted zone into the original hosted zone. But I'm not going to do that. Okay, cool. So now that I've got this, I need to make an alias for this domain. So this process we're actually going to revert once we go into a CDN, but I want to show you how to do it so you know how. So we use the domain that we're going to use. So with the subdomain, www.endlessfont.com, that is correlated to my S3 bucket. It's exactly the same. And I want to use that A type. We use an alias here. We look for alias target. The very first one that comes up is the actual same name, and it is on my S3 bucket. Now, if I used CDN here and went into alias, I have no targets available, right? So you want to make sure that you're using the right name, and that way you can create that. And now we create it. It will take some time for this to actually run. There's one more record that I want to create, and that's an empty record, and say alias yes. And again, that other actual domain there. So that's a little benefit of watching the video, is that little extra context. This other subdomain, this other alias, should redirect to our WW every single time. So I paused the recording for a little bit so I can actually test this out. Hopefully by now I can actually go to endlessfont.com and it'll show up. So we go to www.endlessfont, not fonts, but 1S, in my case 1S. And no HTTPS yet, just www. Perfect. So in my case, it's working. If I get rid of that subdomain, it's also working. Okay, great. So hopefully by now yours is also working. Do realize that, yes, I have Endless Font and Endless Fonts. I bought them both for this exact reason. Now what we need to do is use something called ACM. So if we go to AWS, back in there, we go to ACM. It's called the Amazon or Automated Certificate Manager, or AWS Certificate Manager. And what we do here is, number one, we need to check that we're in North Virginia. This is really important for the certificates. And we're going to go ahead and request a new public certificate, and specifically for our domain here. So you can use both domains. We can do www.endlessfont.com and also just endlessfont.com. Okay. We hit next. We do DNS validation. The reason I can do DNS validation is because I have this already set up in my S3 route, right? So it'll be able to verify this because all of my name servers are over there. Another option is actually using the email method, which is fine too. I'm going to go ahead and create this record in S3. And there we go. And of course, if you have your domain managed somewhere else for some reason, you can add these values into your DNS records as well. So both things are successful. It's going to take a little time for that to actually be issued. So it has some validation. It will work through it and all that. But that's all I really need to do to get an HTTPS certificate. So we use this in lieu of something like Let's Encrypt. Amazon does it for us, and it does it for free as long as you set it up in the way I have. Or at least it has been doing it for free. I don't know if it always will. So now that we've got that, we have to do the next step, which is setting up Cloudfront. So Cloudfront will distribute our content globally. In other words, it will make a content delivery network for this in particular. We're going to go ahead and create a distribution. We're going to use it for the web. Now that we're here, I want to verify that that ACM certificate was created by scrolling down to my SSL certificates, clicking on custom SSL certificate, and then typing it out. And sure enough, it was created. Now, of course, I could actually go back to where that certificate was made to see if it's there, but I certainly want to have this prior to setting up this Cloudfront distribution. So now that we've got that, let's go back to the origin domain name, and that origin is going off of S3. The reason it's going off of S3 is because Cloudfront needs to use the files that are inside of that origin, or in this case, S3. The ID is going to be simply just www.endlessfont.com. Origin path is the root. I can leave that empty. Next thing is the viewer protocol policy. I want to redirect everything to HTTPS. So if they go to HTTP, it will redirect them in a secure environment. I'm going to leave everything else as is. You can change some of the settings if you want to lower the time or something like that. The next thing is the domain names that I actually want to have work for this, which is www.endlessfont.com, and then also just endlessfont.com. And we go ahead and create this distribution. So this will take some time, but while it's loading, I can actually update my route S3. So inside of route 53 rather, inside of route 53, we go into our domain here. And remember how I said we are going to be changing some things. Make sure you go and find that A record again that currently references the S3 file or the S3 bucket in the alias target. Now we want it to reference the Cloudfront distribution. Now you can certainly make another subdomain if you would like, but you would have to ensure that there's a certificate for it and all the other process that we've gone through. So we've got our alias target now into Cloudfront. I'm going to create that. And then also for my subdomain, I will also put that in there as well and save that record set. I'm not entirely sure if this will change or redirect to the www. So we certainly need to test that. If it doesn't redirect, there's one more feature that I want to add into that S3 bucket. And that is going in here, going into our properties, static hosting, and then just changing this whole protocol to HTTPS to ensure that at least it will do that. So we will test the actual route in a moment, but let's go ahead and go back into Route 53. And, well, now we're going to have to just wait because the Cloudfront distribution, which we can open another one into that, we can wait for it to finish, right? So we need it to be deployed. And now when you make changes to those files, they aren't going to be instantaneous on your CDN. There will be some time because they're distributed globally. It's not just distributed in one location like your S3 bucket is. So we would have to wait for that to happen. You could also set up logging and various things for your Cloudfront distribution. Like you could edit this and set up a bucket that will actually do your logging for access and all that. So if you actually want to see the access that's happening, that might be a cool thing to do. Do keep in mind that it does add cost to all of this. And in fact, everything we've done so far, none of it is really free. I like there's pricing to it, but it's really, really inexpensive unless you start having millions of people use this, which is possible, of course. So now with this loading, I'm going to go ahead and open up a new browser window and go to endlessfont.com. So I'm seeing that it cannot be reached, which is actually a good sign. It's showing me that my Route 53 has changed, but I don't think my distribution has finished yet. I'm going to let that finish and then I'll come back. All right, so now after some time, it went through. It was like maybe 5 or 10 minutes. I get this, access denied. Now, I actually skipped something that's in the blog post. So what is it? Let's go ahead and jump back into our CloudFront distributions. Click on the one that you're using. Of course, it's going to be showing you the domains there. Click on edit, scroll to the bottom. Default root object is our index.html page, right? We want that to be on the root. So we go ahead and save that. And now after some more time, it's going to actually run, right? So I do have to give it a little bit of time to update. But if I don't, I can also see that endless.css, I can absolutely access that. And sure enough, it's working. So this means that my content delivery network is working with a custom certificate, with a custom domain. I mean, it's really cool. And as you see, like, sure, it's a little tedious, but it's actually not that difficult to do. And naturally, for many of you, you might be wondering, can you use this for other static assets? Absolutely. You can use the same method. So something else I want to test is, well, let's see if that index file is working now. And it is. So that took a few minutes to actually get that up and going. But now we actually have a domain name too. So if you used something like React.js with this homepage or even Angular, and you didn't need a backend really, or even if you did, you could still run it in the same exact fashion, which is also pretty cool. So now let's go ahead and check the actual root domain, so without www, and sure enough, that's working and not redirecting, right? So it's actually not a huge surprise that it's not redirecting, and I'll tell you why. So if we go back into S3 or CloudFront, either one, we can see that I put both of those domain names here, and both of them are referencing the exact same SSL certificate because they're both on there. That's one thing. But they're also both referencing the same bucket, right? So they're both referencing that domain path. And therefore, they're both able to access it because of how all of this is all set up. Now, if I wanted it to be redirected from the, without www to www, I would just need to do what? Hopefully you know this answer. It's changing in Route 53, changing this from CloudFront or that CloudFront endpoint, and changing it back into the S3 bucket. The challenge with that, though, is it's possible the certificate doesn't work then. So, yeah, I don't want to worry about that. I literally just want to have this whole thing working. So I'm going to have both of them in there and using the redirects as they are currently. As in, they're not there. There's no redirects anymore. Now they just point to the same thing. Pretty cool. So that's it. We now have everything that we set out to do. The trick part here is now actually making changes to this. Like, how do you make changes? Well, it's really simple. As long as you have the original icons and they're in their original names, the changes, all you do is add new SVG icons and deploy them that way. So you add new icons in here, and then you would run this all over again. Now, I don't necessarily want to remember this all over again, so I'm going to go into my package.json. Let's go ahead and open it up into package.json. And under scripts, I'm going to use a fairly common name for a script called build. And this will now build the entire script as we've done. So we save that. And now I can do npm run build. And now it should actually run that generator for us. Now there's other aspects to this that we can make it better, as in, setting up Git so we can push it to the S3 bucket, or we can set up an AWS client that allows us to push it to an S3 bucket as well. But that's additional configuration that we probably don't really need to use at this time. But the configuration that I will want is this right here, to ensure all future versions of my icons are all the same. So there's not a drastic change to the icons unless I alert all of my users, of course, of these icons, or all of my designers, web designers, backend designers, anyone that's using these icons. You want to make sure that's nice and consistent for all of those people. All right, thanks so much for watching.